Alright guys, we're finally at the stage where we're ready to use the router table. We have several router tables here in the shop, and this particular router is set up with a 1/4 inch radius round over bit, which looks a little bit like this. It is measured by the radius of this, I don't know if that's focusing right there for you guys, it's measured by the radius of this carbide piece of steel that is, or carbide metal that is in here with the radius sharpened right there. As the wood is introduced to this bit, like this, focus, this ball bearing will ride against the surface so that the wood doesn't cut any deeper, or the bit doesn't cut the wood any deeper, and it will remove this profile from the edge. So there's just a standard handheld router in here turned upside down, and the bit is mounted inside this table. That's what turns a router into a router table. And there's a large fence that we have here. This fence is currently not being used to guide the wood. We're not going to run the wood against it. We're just going to use it to help hold the dust collection to suck up all the chips and whatnot. My product is ready to go. We sanded it over at the large sander, and everything looks good. All of the edges and lines line up, all the faces and everything look good. We sanded off all the weathered areas. So I still have a little bit of putting to possibly do in the corners where the nails were set with a set nail set, but other than that, everything looks really great. So I'm ready to go ahead and round over all the corners. We don't want these edges sharp. To do that, our next tool that we need to use is the router table. The router table will require that you guys take the router quiz and turn that in on Canvas before we get started. So let's run through these safety questions real quick. Many of these are familiar to you guys. You're already going to know the answers. Number 1, always make sure you're wearing ANSI Z87 safety glasses with side shields when using a router. That was the rest of that question. So number 2, most routers are around 95 decibels, that's the dBA, and require hearing protection for safe use. You definitely want to wear some kind of hearing protection when using a router. Number 3, loose clothes, gloves, jewelry, hoodie cords, or long hair can get caught in moving parts. If you got sleeves, you want to roll them up. You don't want anything dangling down while you're using this thing. This is turning around. If something got caught in there, it'll wrap down and it could like suck your hair in, pull you down into it. That could be a real hazard. So you want to tie your hair back, put it inside a hat, whatever. Nothing loose while you're using a tool like this. So number 4, make sure wood is free from nails, loose knots, and other foreign objects before routing. So obviously I have some nails in my piece. I know where those nails are though, and I know that they're going to clear the router bit. They're not going to hit this, so I'm okay. If you don't know that for sure, you shouldn't be running this through the router. You can always use a metal detector as well and wand the part, or take a magnet to your piece of wood and wave the magnet, a very strong magnet, over the surface and see if it finds anything. Little wooden chips, if you set your wood on the ground as well, little rocks and things on the ground could be just as problematic, so you want to check for that. A magnet will not pick those up. Number 5, always hold the workpiece securely in a vise or clamp so you can keep both hands on the router. So if you need to use a hand router that's not mounted to a table, that applies to you. When using the table router like this, obviously your hands are not going to be holding onto the router because it's screwed or bolted to the table. You're going to keep both hands on the project. Number 6, always inspect the router bit before each use, and never use a bit if the carbide is cracked or appears damaged or dull in any way. So when you're looking really closely at the bit, you want to look at that sharp carbide edge again, and if that, see if that shows up, if that carbide tip, that carbide edge has a chip in it or something like that, then that bit's no good. You don't want to use it. Number 7, always unplug the router before changing the bit. So if you're going to lift the router up and change the bit, you should come get me if you haven't been taught how to do that individually. I also need you to come get me so that I can inspect it before you start using it regardless. But if for any reason you need to raise and lower the bit, make sure that you guys always unplug the tool before you start changing things or touching the bit, holding onto it as you're working on stuff. That's always a good practice with any power tool. Never start the tool when the bit is touching the workpiece. So you want to make sure that the bit can get to full speed. This particular motor is a really large motor. This is a 3¼ horsepower router motor that came out of my old cabinet shop. And this particular bit is, it's going to take a little while for it to get to full speed. You'll hear it. In fact, let me turn it on real quick. Let's see if we can hear it slowly wind up. You can hear how the sound and the pitch changes over time as it slowly gets faster and faster, and then it becomes a steady noise when it's at full speed, and then it slowly stops as well because it's got a break in there. So never start the tool when the bit is touching the workpiece, meaning you don't want this to be here when you start the tool. You want the workpiece to be back here, let it get up to full speed. Otherwise, it's just going to take this part and throw it. Never use a router bit with the bit pointing towards you. So that's in terms of a handheld router. Again, this is a table router, so that doesn't totally apply here. But I have seen guys using handheld routers that hold the router with the bit facing them, and it'll be on, they'll be doing something, they'll be carrying it around. Never a good idea. For control, routers should be held firmly with both hands. Okay? Again, here it's held by a table, so that means the project is held with both hands. If you're using a handheld router and you're holding the router with both hands, then your project needs to be secured or clamped down in some way. Before plugging in a router, make sure the switch is in the off position. This switch and the switch on the router itself should both be in the off position when you're working on it and you're about to plug it in and you're just finished up. In this particular situation, we have a bypass switch on the table, so we don't have to constantly get all the way underneath the table and switch the router switch itself, which is on the, technically it's the bottom of the router in this orientation. Always feed the stock, this is number 12, against the rotation of the bit to avoid a climb cut. Let me explain what a climb cut is. Sometimes a climb cut is necessary. So just like all the other power tools, the sander that we were just using recently, you want to look at whatever rotation that the bit or the cutter is going in, and you want to go in the opposite direction so it doesn't throw the workpiece and you can stay in control of everything. If you go in the same direction it wants to throw it, that's going to be a climb cut. And you have very little control, but sometimes it's the only way to prevent tear out. You have to do that in a very methodical and controlled fashion. You want to avoid that also whenever possible, which is why it says here, always make sure to avoid a climb cut. Number 13, never set the tool down until the motor and the bit have come to a complete stop. So that's with any power tool. If it's still moving in any way, you shouldn't be setting it down if you're using a handheld version. Number 14, bits larger than 1 inch in diameter or longer than 1.5 inches should be used in a freehand router. Should not be used in a freehand router. It is best for those larger bits. The table router is the best application for those larger bits. We will put the larger bits in this router. Those router tables next to me do not have very large motors in them, so I like to use this router for that application. Number 15, when sharpening on edge, maybe today I'll learn how to read. When shaping an edge on a router table, always route with the bit inside the fence and the material edge against the fence. Never route the far edge, which traps the stock between the bit and the fence. Okay? Again, the answer to that one was edge. When shaping an edge on the router table, because that's typically what we're doing, always route with the bit inside the fence. So this particular application we're going to do today is going to use this ball bearing right here, so we don't have to worry about that. Number 16, don't bottom out the bit in the collet or partially insert the bit. Instead, completely insert the bit's shank. That's the bottom of the bit here. The part that gets held onto is called the shank, and the clamp inside the router that holds it is called the collet. So you want to insert it all the way and then back it off, pull it back out about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch. You never want the bottom of this bit touching the metal inside the router. over time the vibration can cause that thing to kick out, and you may not be able to fully tighten it if that's the case. Number 17. When using a router table, always use push blocks to position your hand a safe distance from the bit. Okay, we've got a whole bunch of push sticks and push blocks here so that you can use those. Number 18. End grain should always be routed before long grain to reduce tear out and splintering. In this particular project, you want to route all of these ends first and then do all of the long edges. If for some reason this does tear out, you'll be able to likely cover up or cut out the part that got torn out. If you do this first and then you come over and do the end grain and it tears out, there's nothing you can do to fix it other than maybe putty and paint. Let's see, number 19. When using a router table, you'll need to open the dust gate to keep your chips from falling into the motor and close it when finished. So right here we have our dust gate. We want to open and close that as we're working. Number 20. It is always advisable to make a test cut on a piece of scrap lumber the same thickness as your good finished pieces to make sure the router is going to do what you want. Okay, that's all the answers that you need for the quiz. If you have any questions about that, let me know. I'm going to go ahead and start working on the rest of this. Let's transition, and I will clean all this stuff up so we can start actually doing some routing. Turn in your answers so that you can do the same thing, and we'll meet back here in just a moment. Alright, so I have turned on the dust collector for this application. I don't like running this without it. The other thing is I've got a piece of scrap wood. It's just a piece of 3/4 inch scrap pine. I'll do a quick test cut. I'm going to open the dust gate, and I'm going to put my hearing protection on before I start using this machine. Of course, I've always got my eye protection on, so make sure you're wearing all of your safety gear, and we'll get started. So I went ahead and did a nice little test cut. This is going to give me a profile that I like. It's just a little bit of a 1/4 inch round over. There's no step involved, so the router bit's set up really nicely. Let's go ahead and route the rest of it. Remember to do all that end grain first. Alright, so that's pretty much it here. We've got nice rounded edges. The front's been rounded over. The only thing I haven't rounded over is this inside area where the phone goes, and I'm going to do that by hand with a little bit of sandpaper. I don't need the same amount of radius to all of those edges. I just need enough to make sure they don't splinter and they hold the phone nice and securely. We're pretty much ready for some finish sanding. There's a little bit of roughness from some of the routed edges that I want to sand out, and I will make all that disappear with a little bit of sandpaper. Then if you want to put some oil on this, some paint, or however you want to finish it, or if you just want to let it weather naturally, that's entirely up to you. This project's pretty much ready to go. We'll be able to test it pretty soon. We'll see you over there at the sanding table where I'm going to do a little bit of sanding.